Hi guys! So today I'm going to show you how I made Edward Elric's coat from Fullmetal Alchemist using the simplicity pattern that I got from Joanne's. Before we start, let me tell you about finding the right pattern size for you. You may notice that there are 3 numbers at the top of the pattern. Those indicate the sizes that are in that packet, and there are other packets with different sizes in them. To figure out your pattern size, there are 3 main measurements you'll need: your bust, waist, and hip. These measurements will help you find your size for any pattern. On the back of the pattern, you'll be able to find these sizes with the corresponding measurements for the material you need. Of course, you can always get more or less depending on what you're making. And if you can't find a pattern exactly like the one you need for a costume, don't worry. Use your creativity to adjust the pattern for your costume or make your own pattern. Now, it's time to open the packet. Here, I've laid out the pattern pieces and the instructions. In this packet, there are 2 different patterns, pattern A and pattern B. For this coat, I'm using pattern A, so I will roughly cut out the pieces marked with the letter A. On the pattern, you'll see different lines and numbers. Remember those sizes on the back of the packet? You'll be cutting out the pattern line that matches your size. Once you cut the pattern, it can only be used for your size. However, they can be used for different sizes if you fold along the lines or make curves with chalk, but keep in mind that the pattern paper is very thin, so be careful not to rip it. There are also different marks to help you match up the pieces as you follow the instructions. The instructions also have a key with the different marks to look out for in other directions. In this video, I'll show you how to make these marks as I cut the pieces out of the fabric. Okay, so I forgot to mention that they also have how many you should cut. So when it's folded, you already have either cut 2, you already have cut 2. So this one specifically asked for cut 4, so I had to do it twice. So I have 4 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 individual pieces. In order to do that, I kinda ran out of fabric, so I have less fabric there. It's all messed up, but I'm gonna trim them all anyway since this is too long for my legs. My legs are not that long anyway, so I'm gonna trim it off. But I would get more fabric next time, maybe a half a yard more than I expect to need, because then I wouldn't run into the problem of running out of fabric. So there's that, just to keep in mind. The pattern has estimates, but I didn't do that. Okay, so as you see, I cut out the paper pattern. I cut out the paper pattern first, but only roughly, and then I put it onto the fabric, which is folded. But I didn't show that because I forgot to do that. I forgot to film that. But that's okay. So there's these things, all these little marks on here from it's on the paper too. But that symbol shows that you have to write it on the center fold. And so when you unpin it, then it will be folded. And I also made sure that all the pattern pieces, all these arrows are the same way, because then they would have the same stretch instead of being off and awkward. So this one, the pattern, the arrow is slanted, so you would actually have to put the pattern this way so that it's the same length. And so now I have to cut all these little marks. So as you see, there's tiny little triangle marks for each line in all the patterns. So my pattern size was 14 that I needed, so I cut it on the 14. And so you'll cut this triangle here that's right next to the 14. You don't have to cut it like a triangle, you can just cut it like a slit, because that's gonna be the mark for that you're gonna need for later. You're gonna need to know so that you can sew and match the pieces together on these marks. So for example, the bodice side and the bodice side front, these parts are going to be, they're most likely going to match up all these marks. That's what you're trying to do. So I'm gonna continue doing that, and I'll probably do that as a time lapse, and if I come across any marks, then I'll probably show you. There's also these little dots that are on the fabric, on the pattern. So you're gonna mark that on the fabric itself. So when you unpin it, try to keep it like together, to keep it together. And you're gonna mark it with chalk or something light, at least, to mark the fabric. If you're using a darker or a lighter fabric or if you're using a lighter fabric that the white chalk won't show up, then you use a different colored chalk, either blue, yellow, orange, or you could even use like pencil or marker for that. So I have 4 pieces in front of me. This is the ones for part 1. It tells you need all of those things. And it tells you what to do as you go along. For now, I'm just gonna pin it down to to show you how it should look when it's together. But stay stitches, just make sure you keep it straight, kind of thing. You don't really need to do that part, so I'm probably not going to do that. I'm just gonna pin it instead. So here, I'm matching the marks I made to each other and pinning along the edge. It might be difficult to pin the curves since they're not exactly flat, but that's okay. Just try to keep it as even as you can as you go along. You also notice that I haven't sewn anything yet. I like to pin down the big or main pieces first so I have an idea of what I'm doing and how it will look before I sew it. Another note I want to make is that if you're using a fabric like pleather, then the pins will leave holes, so try to keep the pins closer to the edge or seam you'll create, or use clips. Then, when you're done pinning everything down, you're just sewing along those pins or the clips to create the seam. When you're done sewing, you'll iron the seams flat. This will make it easier to sew down to create a top stitch, which will be in a later step. Now, attaching the sleeve can be confusing, and that's okay. I'll be helping you out. So, you're going to take the sleeve and you're going to turn the sleeve so that the right side is out. This means that the chalk marks should also be on the outside. This way, when you put the sleeve in, the right sides of the fabric should be facing each other. Now, you'll take the mark that's in the middle and pin that to the shoulder. When you do this, the whole of the sleeve should be facing you. When you pin that down, pin the other marks on the other sides and then the bottom. This will help to arrange the pins and gather any extra fabric. When you're done pinning it down, you can carefully pull the sleeve inside out to test if you pinned the sleeve on correctly. If it looks like a regular sleeve, then you did it great. You did it correctly. Then I do this to the other side. When you're done with the sleeves, sew them on around the hole. If there's a little bit of gaps or extra fabric, that's okay. Pin it together and sew it over it. Then you try on your coat. So my piece came out a little too long for me, so I roughly made a mark where I want the sleeve to end. And then I fold the fabric over and pin it down so that I can sew it and make a clean hem. When you're done sewing the base of the top piece, match the marks at the bottom of the top piece to the skirt. Pin at these marks and then pin the parts where the seams match. By doing this, the seam will look like it will continue from the bottom to the top. Then when you're done sewing these together, you'll make the top stitches. I learned after I sewed all of the top stitches on the skirt section that you had to continue the top stitches to the top piece too. This means that the seam where the top piece and the skirt meet have to be flat on their sides before you sew over it. When you're done sewing those, you'll also sew a top stitch along the seam where the skirt and the top piece meet. Next, I sew the pieces for the hood band, and the pieces to form the hood base. When I'm done sewing the hood pieces, I put the band onto the hood. I match up the marks and then pin at the marks so then it lines up, and I'll be sewing the rest of it. By the end, the seam should be on one side and all the pins should be lining it, and then you sew it down. When you're done sewing the hood pieces together, they should look like this. Next, I'm matching the marks on the top of the coat to the bottom of the hood and pinning them down. When I'm done with that, then I pin along the edge so that the edge of the hood and the coat are the same. When you're done pinning, you can pull the hood up to make sure the hood is pinned correctly to the coat. Now I'm cutting the inner facing. I didn't cut the inner facing at first, so I'm cutting it now. It's going to be used for the edge of the coat where a zipper would go. The inner facing makes the fabric feel stiffer, so if you're using a thick fabric already, you might not need it depending on how thick you want it. I'm using a lightweight fusible inner facing so that I can iron it down instead of creating a stay stitch so that it doesn't move. Then I pin down the inner facing so that the inner facing is facing upwards. This way, when the pieces are sewn down, the right side of the fabric will show. Before I finish sewing the inner facing in and hand the bottom of the coat, I made marks. The coat was too long for me, so I made these marks to figure out where I'll cut and where I want the fabric to end. Then I pin the inner facing down at the seam so the inner facing doesn't show, and pin the bottom of the coat. Then I sew these parts. When I'm finished sewing the sides and the bottom of the coat, I also sew along the edge of the interfacing that was at the neck and the shoulders. To create the emblem, I drew and cut out a pattern of the emblem with an X-Acto knife and used that on the fabric vinyl that I found at Michael's. So here's how it looked when it was ironed on. Now here's the final product. I really enjoyed making this, and I'm really proud with how it turned out. If you liked the video, give it a like, comment what you'd like to see, and subscribe. Bye!